Welcome to the first featured guest roundtable at Pedestrian Space, hosting with the Global Walkability Correspondence Network. Many participants from the network are in attendance here, and our first featured guest is Professor Garrick, currently based in Switzerland, in Zurich. Professor Garrick is a professor emeritus of civil engineering at the University of Connecticut. You have a very rich work profile and also history of homes. I want to thank you for being here and being the first featured guest of the Roundtable series.
It's an honor, and it's really nice and impressed. And I'm impressed to see so many people giving up their Fridays to be here.
Everybody's extremely excited to talk about auto-dependency with you, which is the title of this, which actually Professor Garrick crafted the title for this roundtable, which is called Auto-Dependency, Normalizing the Abnormal. I'd really like to mainly have you talking and sharing about your background, but to begin with, I just want to share how I became acquainted with you. It was on LinkedIn. I learned about your work, I became interested, sent the connection request, and very quickly became very engaged in what I call the storytelling you do of public transit in Zurich. These photos you take of scenes of mobility there. And I just want to say I've really enjoyed your media, your storytelling. So I would love to actually just start off with that, your use of social media, your use of LinkedIn to share snapshots of mobility from your city of residence.
Yeah, well, I don't really know what to say about that, because I think it's when I guess all of us got into this in a very ad hoc way. And for me, it was really just about sharing some of the amazing things, or things that seem amazing to me that I see on the streets in Zurich. And, you know, this is a way of sharing and a way of just getting other people to experience what I'm experiencing here. I have over the years shared a lot of this type of material in the classroom setting. So it's nice to have a different type of audience and also a different type of media to share it in.
Right, and I call them transit observations. A lot of them are your observations with lovely photos. I have to say, really lovely photos. But your life has also thus far spanned several different regions. So maybe we can dive right now into who you are. I go by a 4Ws model often when talking with people. So who you are, what you work with, why and where. And I think for all of these W's, it's very interesting with you, the who. We can begin with the who and the where, for example.
Okay, so maybe I'll start at the beginning, I guess. I am a Jamaican native. I grew up in and around the city of Kingston, Jamaica. And I went to college in the island of Trinidad and Tobago. We had one university system at the time when I was growing up, and the engineering school was there. So I went to Trinidad for engineering, came back to Jamaica, and then I ended up, after 3 years in Jamaica, I realized that island life was really tough, because for me, it was so confining to live on a small island. So I decided to go to grad school, and I was very pragmatic about my choice of subject to study. So I ended up studying the chemistry of asphalt, because I thought as an immigrant, that is where I would have the best opportunity to find job after I graduated with a PhD from Purdue University. So I did get a job at the University of Connecticut as their asphalt expert. And I built a career. I got tenure. And I remember 2 years after I got tenure, I was sitting at home feeling very depressed. And my husband came home, and I said to him, I can't do this. I can't do this for the rest of my life. So I started coming up with plans, and one of them was just to quit academia and to go back to planning school. That's what I thought at the time. So it took me a long process to get to where I am in my career now, because I really had to change career while I was in situ at the University of Connecticut in transportation engineering. It started out the career change started out by going to live in the UK, in Cambridge, where I was studying truck vibration. And it turned out that what was interesting about living in Cambridge had nothing to do with what I was studying in the lab, but it had everything to do with the fact that I had been living in America for 10 years, and now I was in this environment where I was seeing old people on the streets, I was seeing people using transit, I was seeing people riding bikes. And this fascinated me because in my transportation engineering, I never learned about any of these things. And what we were teaching at the University of Connecticut didn't comport at all with any of what I was seeing on the streets in Cambridge. So that really started the change for me of change of career. And I went back to Connecticut and I had to teach myself simple things like, where does a bike lane fit into a street cross section? I knew nothing about that as a transportation engineer coming out of Purdue, and doing 5, 6, 7 years as a non-tenured faculty. So it took me a while to get to understanding the connections between land use, design, etc. But it was really all about self-education. So that's kind of where I am now.
And to continue on with the where, you were in Zurich. So how did that?
And that's a totally accidental situation where Zurich was the first place I ever visited in Europe. This was in 1985. I went to visit a friend that I'd met at Purdue, and I'd gone. The conversation started with me saying to her, how can Switzerland be in the World Cup? There's no flat place to play soccer. And she said, come and see. So I got to Switzerland, and I fell in love with the place, but I never thought it was going to be a place that I would end up living. But over the time, I started coming back more often, and I also started to realize that it was a very special place from the point of view of the work that I was studying. So this is really, I spent 2 sabbatical leaves here, and I started to understand the transit system, and I wanted to learn more and more. And part of the reason for wanting to live here is to really to understand the system from the inside out.
Right. So how long have you been there, and what are some, if you can share some takeaways? I think some of the questions are definitely going to have to do with what you're observing in Zurich. I know in a call that you and I had previously, you mentioned too that some of your work, it's about understanding development of auto dependence in different cities and how it's been combated. For example, in your work specifically, Zurich and Amsterdam, for example.
Yeah, well, when I first came to Zurich, it was a very different place. The friend that I visited, we would come into the city every day by car. This was in the late 80s. Nowadays, I'm still very close with this lady, and we would never consider coming into the city with cars. And so it shows the evolution that this city has undertaken. And that kind of evolution, that kind of history is very interesting to me. I'm very close friends with Peter Norton, because he was one of the first people to go back and dig into the history of how we became so auto-dependent. And so this issue of the history and understanding the history is not something that is done in engineering, and it's something that really fascinates me. So this transformation of Zurich is really fascinating, because it kind of belies some of the things you hear about places like Zurich, is that they're rich, they've always been like that, etc. But if you try to understand the history, it might help us to understand how other places can transition. And that's one of the things that really fascinates me about here.
And so you've been there to see part of the transition, or you're also snapshotting it with back in the mid 80s to more recent times to when you relocated, and now you're also digging into the history of the shift that happened there?
Yeah, so I've been It's been both. So the memories from the 1980s are not really very informed because I was still just looking at the pavement, as I say. Yeah, in engineering, you just look at the pavement, you don't think about anything else beyond that. So I really don't have much understanding of what was going on in terms of transportation or land use, etc. But is when I came in 2011 for my first sabbatical, that is when I started to dig more into the history. I would go to the archives. It's been a challenge because my German is not all there. So trying to read stuff that is happening here is tough when I don't have English sources. But it's both observing the change that has happened since then and also digging into the history is what I've been doing.
Also continuing on with this, which I think easily could be hours-long discussions and extremely interesting. You mentioned also in a previous call we had that a lot of your work is guided by your upbringing in Kingston. You mentioned watching the sheer horror of how the city of Kingston was transformed by auto dependency. Could you share a bit about that as well?
Yeah, so my basic thesis is that what happens in America from a auto dependency point of view influences how the entire planet develop. And the way that gets transmitted, it's not just through colonial attitudes, but it's also in the case of America from media, from movies, from TV, etc. So if we are going to tackle auto dependency in the rest of the world, we need to start with at least trying to fix what is going on in America, because America has so much influence on the rest of the world. And I grew up in a Kingston that is quite different from the one that is there now. When I lived in Spanish Town, which was a satellite city close to Kingston. I used to ride my bike everywhere. Now the idea of doing that horrifies me. And in fact, when I went back, I spent a sabbatical leave there in 2004. I thought I was going to ride my bike while I lived at the University of the West Indies campus. And I quickly found that this was an impossibility. So it's a lot of my work is directed at trying to understand the core causes and also the impacts of auto dependency in order to give people, certainly people in Jamaica, tools to counteract what is going on in a country like that.
Right, and connected to this topic and your interest in sort of helping this awareness come about in Jamaica, you've mentioned the cost of to people of auto dependency, and also car culture as linked to import economy, and additionally the linkage of marketing of cars, particularly to poorer places, as a symbol of modernity and development. So could you share a bit on those things as well?
Yeah, that's a broad topic, but let me say, when I lived in Jamaica, the 3 years after I graduated from undergrad, before I went to grad school, I lived in Spanish Town. And if I wanted a social life in Kingston at the time, I needed to have a car. It's impossible to have a social life. And what I found was I ended up spending maybe 60% of my salary on a 10-year-old VW. So gas, ownership, all of that. And it was perennially breaking down. And that is the experience of millions of people all over, billions of people all over the world, because they're living in this auto dependency, but they cannot afford to be part of the car dependency culture. So that's part of it. Another part of it that Jamaica really highlighted for me was the fact that while I was in Jamaica, I spent 3 months without a car during my sabbatical and 1 month with a car. And what I discovered and what I had never really thought about was that the 3 months I didn't have a car, I was part of a local economy. I would shop in the markets. I would walk through the markets. I would shop in the markets. I would buy from local vendors. And I found out that as soon as I got a car, it was much harder to do that. I ended up going to the supermarket and living in a totally different environment. So that connection between autodependency and self-sufficiency for places like Jamaica is just so dramatic. I don't think I would have understood that without living in a place like Jamaica without a car.
I just have one more question before we turn it over to Q&A, because I think there's going to be a lot of interesting questions. You mentioned your good friend, Professor Norton, who I also look forward to hosting at a future roundtable. I recently had a chat with him that was recorded, and we spoke about also many of these issues and the contradictions, as he called it, in the current mobility paradigm shift as we are both in Europe. There's a lot going on at the EU level with shifting the mobility paradigm in municipalities across the EU, and then also struggle with auto dependency all over Europe, as it is all over the world. And then in other places, the trajectory seems to be going the other way, with auto dependency on the great rise and municipalities not really doing anything, it appears, for a sustainable shift. So I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about this sort of epic tension that the mobility paradigm is shifting in one direction in some places, and other places that they're taking the model of car dependence and sort of just running with it, and it's just increasing.
Well, what we have is a massive ship that we are just starting to try to turn around. And it's just, there are so many forces pushing auto dependency: the car sellers, the oil sellers, the governments are all in the pocket of people that want cars, but also a lot of the populations in these various places think of cars and highways as development. So there's a lot to change, and we are seeing changes. But if you think about the magnitude of what is needed to fully change the system, it's not surprising that we're seeing things moving in two directions at the same time. I think it's what is surprising is that we have made so much inroad over the last 10 years.
Can you share some of your observations on those inroad movements that have happened?
Yeah, I can give, well, one of the biggest inroad in the US has to do with we're starting to pay attention to people walking and biking. Actually, the bike revolution is probably the biggest one that has been the most dramatic in American cities. Up until 20 years ago, very few American cities had more than a 5% share of people biking. And that has changed in some cities after cities. And even those cities that are not really changing pretend as if, or say that they want to change. So I think that's been one of the biggest. But the other one is this sense that walking is real transportation, biking is real transportation, and the desire that a lot of places have expressed that they want to go in that direction. But a big one also is that we now have design tools that people that want to design places for people on foot or on bike, they have those in places. 15 years ago, that was not the case. We had to rely on the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials and their guide about how streets should be designed. So there's been a lot of changes, lots and lots further to go.
And can you give us just a snapshot of your observation of what's happening in Jamaica in terms of advocacy or any landscape of a collective that's agitating for change?
Well, it's interesting you asked, and I'm laughing because I just got an email. I just had a discussion with two um, young folks in Jamaica that have started something called, I don't remember what they're calling it now, but it's a movement. I think it's Island Lab that they're calling it. And they are developing this program to try and push back at government's current plan to turn basically all surface streets in Kingston into highways. And they've written a very nuanced, very well-written document that I'm supposed to be reviewing right now about it. So there are people that are being educated to go back to places like Jamaica to try to change the direction in places like that. You have a
Okay,
long way to go, though. It's a tough fight in a place like that.
right. And as we know, that fight is mirrored in communities all over the planet. As you said earlier, billions have this reality. And I'm really curious to learn more about those young advocates. Maybe we can welcome them to our network.
I
And,
think so, definitely. I'll put you in touch with them.
okay, speaking of the network, there are several participants here from the Global Walkability Correspondence Network. So I would like to open up to Q&A. So please feel free to raise hands. Nicole, I see you dropping a question. Would you like to share a question, Nicole? Is she there? Okay, Nicole. Okay, yeah. Okay, she's it. Okay, so Nicole Roberts, who works for the Downtown Alliance for St. Petersburg and has an initiative called Car Free St. Pete in Florida. She's the project manager for that. She asks, here in America, there is huge association between car ownership and freedom. In your experience, have you seen this correlation present in other countries, and how do you address this narrative?
Yes, it's certainly true in Jamaica. I actually also I did some work in Africa. It's true there. It's not just freedom though. Freedom is a meme that is used in richer countries, but in poorer countries, it's not just the issue of freedom. It's also this issue of modernity. Is also the issue of, I remember years ago, I met a young man on the streets of Kingston, and he told me that if you don't have a car in Jamaica, to express your bona fides, you need to dress properly. If you have a car, you don't need to dress. You can dress anyhow, you're fine. So, you know, this sense of self-worth of having a car, those are all kinds of themes that have been sold to us over the years. When the first highway opened in Jamaica, I remember my sister saying to me, she said, "Mr. Proud" in Jamaican, which means I am so proud. And the irony of her saying that was she had just given up on her car because she couldn't afford it. So it's, you know, there are lots of these themes that are used to drive home the idea that car ownership is essential. And in terms of the places that we're building, it actually makes it that it's very difficult to live in a lot of these places without cars. So the reality is, yes, that because of how we have created places and we continue to transform places, it's really hard to be without cars. That doesn't necessarily mean that cars and freedom equate. It means that cardom and freedom equate because of how we have made places. One of the things about living in Zurich that I find fascinating is the freedom I feel from not having a car. But most people do not live in this environment and will never experience this. And this is something that has been built up over 30 years, that they've gotten to the place where the freedom of not having a car is just incredible. So it's a really hard idea to fight against when we have left everything to big roads, everything spread out, etc.
I'm going to be quoting you on that, Professor Garrick. The freedom of not having a car is incredible. In my mind, we will have
Well,
a mechanism. Go ahead.
I must say that whenever I go back to Connecticut, I fly through Boston, and I can tell you, just looking down on the landscape from the plane, getting into Logan Airport depresses me. You know, all the land devoted to cars, all the big highways, and then actually landing on the ground at Logan Airport is one of the most depressing things that I can imagine, that I have to go back into that life.
Beverly has a question.
I do. I'm just blown away. First of all, Professor Garrick, thank you for this. Yeah, lots of insights happening that I hadn't making connections thanks to what you're saying. And I completely relate to what you're saying about the freedom of not having a car. I feel the same way, but I also live in a very dense community where I can walk here and there. So I can appreciate why people would feel that a car is freedom, because if they're kind of in a remote and they can't access, basic things. So what do you see? How can we bridge that gap if we're building spread out for cars? How can we flip that idea of freedom on its head?
In many situations, the way that we've built places, people need cars to survive. But that doesn't mean that there's a necessary association between car and freedom. Living in a city like Zurich, there's a great association between trams and freedom, or walking and freedom. We just need to break that relationship and say that that is not necessarily so. When we say that there is a relationship between car and freedom, we're saying that this is always the case. And instead of saying that because we have built places that makes it difficult to get around other means, this is why we have this correlation. We need to really break that relationship because it's not true. And so what happens is there are many places in America where people could live car-free. Places like Buffalo, New York, for example. But because we have this immediate relationship between car and freedom, it's really tough to convert those kinds of places into, or to start to do the small transitions that would make those places work car-free. And so we need to really break this immediate association.
Thank you so much.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that? And I would love to just hear some of your ideas about breaking that association. This is sort of the heart of the work I envision for pedestrian space, is breaking the psychological association. So I would love, Professor Garrick, to hear some of your ideas about breaking that association.
Well, I think some of it has to do with language. For example, my husband was in the hospital, which I can see from here, in December. And one of the messages that we got from the hospital was telling him to bring pajamas, whatever else. And they also told him, don't bring your car, we have no parking. And I think about that because when we go to the hospital or the doctor in Hartford, they will say something like, drive home safely. So there's that immediate association that everybody is going to come by car. There is a lot of bias built into the language. One of them that we have been trying to fight with my research is this idea of vulnerable road users. And it sounds, a lot of people use it thinking that they are progressing to be considering other users of the road. But what I found in my research is that these so-called vulnerable road users are not inherently vulnerable. They are made vulnerable by the type of places we built. And the way that we have shown this is that in the Netherlands, the risk of dying in a car crash for a pedestrian or for a bike or somebody on a bike is the same as that of somebody in a car. In the US, we're talking about order of magnitude 10 times more for pedestrians, for bikers. So it's not about the vulnerability of the person, is the type of environment we have created to put these people at risk. So all of these language things are really important to get at, to try to change how people think about who is using the road, who should be using the roads, etc. Another example that we're working on with, I'm working on with currently with one of my PhD students, is this idea of captive transit users. And that really grates me because it's basically, it's used in American research, for example, to say that these are people we don't need to consider because they're captive, therefore they are going to use transit anyway. And one of the things that we have found in our research is that we should also be paying attention to captive drivers. People like myself, when I lived in Jamaica, when I was paying 60% of my salary for owning a car. I'm not driving because I can afford it. I'm driving because I have no other good choices. So all of these kinds of things about how we use language, about the assumptions behind how we use language, I think is an important thing to challenge.
Great, thank you. Zvi, you have a question.
Oh, it's okay. Hello, it's been such a pleasure listening to all of your stories, Norman. I can really relate to many of them. I actually had an uncle who retired to Jamaica, actually, and I visited him there. And the one and only time that I had the chance to drive on the left-hand side of the road was in Jamaica.
That's a scary experience, I can tell you, going from one to the other.
Yeah, and he actually did not own a car when he was there. So I got to see a bit of both and to appreciate the social extremes in the society there. Like when the price of fuel went up very much, there was national rioting over the price of fuel, and they would block the access to the airport. This was something that we had to pay attention to, actually.
Yes, I remember. That was part of that.
Yes. So it's been very fascinating. I want to bring it back to sort of the systemic challenges that we're facing, which you've already talked about, and how basically everything, like, people don't realize that governments building roads is actually relatively recent. It's only since the cars, and in fact, it was originally cyclists who asked the government to get involved in building proper road infrastructure. And when the governments, in the end, they recognize the importance of the good roads movements in the US and other places. And when the government finally got involved in that, that actually took government to a completely new scale, like something that historically government didn't build roads per se. And if they did, it was like toll roads only. So like we've literally like increased the size of our government institutions around this sort of, it's a whole package, like car development, basically. It's land use, and it's all the associated industries and employment. And this is like a number of jobs and things that are involved in it, and even the asphalt, like building roads and the amount of material that goes into them. It's mind-boggling, actually, the quantity of resources that we invest in it. So as you said, it's sort of like trying to change the Titanic. And I think one way or another, we're going to have to, because we're pushing limits, planetary limits and everything. But my question is actually, when we're talking about mobility and all these things, all too often we neglect parking, actually. And I think in the US, like, they've always been very generous and sort of forcing that there to be parking everywhere. And basically people take it for granted that they will have a parking space, most often free, wherever their destination is. You roll out of bed in the morning, you get in your car, you don't have to pass through any public domain at all. And many other places are not like that. And or certainly not to the same extent that you have in the United States and other Anglo-oriented societies. And I think this is actually like a crucial thing, like how we structure parking and where it is. Like in Europe, they're actually on-street parking is the exception rather than the rule. And pay parking as well is very common. So like there's a very, very different attitude towards how parking is offered and where. And I think this is something that's in many countries in the developing world who've adopted this sort of auto-oriented growth paradigm. They're massively sprawling. And I completely agree with your points about, parking being freedom. And also I happen to live in a city where I also feel liberated not owning a car, and I have pity for people who do own a car. But in many developing regions, like there's been so much regional sprawl and cities are so massive and their transportation options are so limited. Like I have a colleague in Iran who we're talking about road safety in Iran, for example. And he said, when you physically cannot get from point A to point B, like road safety sort of is a secondary issue. And and he's right. Like if there is no way to get other than a car from these places, like so, and this is how we're building cities, like all around the world. Like literally, like the massively developing cities in Africa. There's I don't know, probably 50 cities that are pushing 10 million people now, and they're massive. Like the scale of these cities, they're sprawling in every which direction, and we're creating sort of like a situation where you physically cannot survive without having mobility. Not necessarily a car, like you see motorcycles is a very common way of getting around as well. But we're creating places where you cannot live without having access to some form of mobility to cover much larger distances. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, well, particularly the parking. I guess that's really what I'm curious about. We all too often we don't talk about that when we're talking about our mobility ecosystem and the role of when parking is easy, then the car is sort of like the natural choice.
Right.
Whereas
let me talk first about the sprawling cities, because the irony of these sprawling cities is that they're being built for a minority.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so I mean, if everybody in those sprawling cities were to be somehow magically get access to cars, they would just totally shut down. There is just no possibility that Lagos or Accra or Nairobi could survive. So what we're really talking about is providing mobility, building cities around an elite in those places. So that's one thing. The second thing is that parking is absolutely the most important subject when it comes to transportation, because without parking, auto dependency doesn't work. And the other thing about parking, though, we have spent a lot of time studying parking. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, 60% of the city is devoted to either storing cars or for roads. 60%. And we have shown pictures showing the destruction of Bridgeport from 1913 to now. But what is interesting about parking is that when I studied parking in Zurich, they have been very progressive from around 1970. But it wasn't until the 1990s that they started to deal with parking, because parking is such an emotional issue. And I find it funny that they had to have something called a historical compromise to deal with parking in Zurich in 1994. That's when they finally got around to dealing with parking. So yes, you're right. Parking is extremely important to this discussion.
Thank you for your comments.
Mohammed, did you have a question? I see a I see a comment here. I wasn't sure if you want to ask. Okay. Also, we'll ask anybody who's not, let's mute people who are not speaking right now. So please feel free, everybody, to raise hands, drop questions in. We have a question here, Matvi in the Ukraine. one of our youngest correspondents. Nice seeing you here, Mapvi. His question is about cycling infrastructure. What should appear in the city first so it can become more bikeable?
Well, I don't know who it is attributed to. I've seen it being attributed to the former planning director in Vancouver, who says that deciding to build a bridge by counting the amount of people swimming across the river is like deciding to build parking facility by counting the numbers of parking, or the other way around, deciding to build parking facilities by counting the amount of people biking is like deciding to build a bridge by counting the amount of people swimming across that river. You really, if you don't have safe infrastructure, it's going to be really difficult for people to be biking. You've seen it in cities after city after city in America. That's Portland, when they started building their biking facility, they were told that, why are you doing this? Nobody bikes here. Now, 10% of the population bike to work in Portland. The same thing in Cambridge. Actually, when I first saw biking facility going up in Cambridge, Mass, I was like, what are they doing? And then now 10% of the population bike. The same thing in Zurich, because they just started building bike facility 10 years ago. You have to build safe facilities if you're going to get people to use bike, etc.
Matt V, please feel free to let us know if you have more questions on that issue. Maria Valeria, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, I wanted to say that I was born in a small city in Argentina, and there the car culture is so rooted in people. And despite the fact that it's a small city and you can go everywhere cycling or even by foot, but people really, really like using the cars. So to the point that, for example, weekends, they go to the city center and they just park their cars in front of the main square and just, I don't know, just to show off. Or so my question is, how do you think that it's possible to kind of change that trends and to break this, what you mentioned, between the association between cars and modernity, or cars y status?
Well, there are good examples of cities in Latin America that has at least reversed some of these trends. The city of Curitiba is an example that people always point to. How it has happened in various places in Latin America is to have strong mayors. In the case of Curitiba, it was that they got to the point where they realized that the direction they were going just wasn't working for them. And so they gave the world something that we didn't have before, this idea of bus rapid transit that came out of Latin America. Similarly, we have seen Bogota in this case, a lot of the leadership came from the mayors. So policies, leadership, but also advocacy can change. But as you're pointing out, it's very, very, very tough to do that, because in a small place like this, people probably associate cars with doing well. So how do you fight back against that? But that is the challenge that we are taking on. We're really taking on people's sense of self, of people's sense of what development means, of what being prosperous means. Those are the type of things we're taking on, and it's very tough. But there are places where it's also changed. I think Buenos Aires actually has been doing a relatively good job in changing the paradigm in that city. I don't know where it is now, but 10 years ago, they were doing quite well.
Okay, let's see. Mohammed, you have a question?
Yes, I have. Okay. Hi, Professor. Thank you for your great presentation. Okay. I wrote my questions. Also, I have to see my notes. Sorry for that. Okay, I have a memory like an elephant. Sorry. Okay, I see people in my country own their car for various purposes. For example, they're using one car for going to work and another car for going to party. That's really interesting. I don't know, maybe it's because the blood that you talked about in Jamaica, maybe that's coming from that area in a third world country. Unfortunately, I live in Iran. Sorry about that. But the point is that what I wanted to say is we see a lot of people go to grocery stores or big malls to buy grocery stores or shops for the whole family. And the family are usually in Iran, we have large families. So people cannot hold, the whole garbage or the whole plastic bags and for the family and carry it by walking to their home or carrying to the nearest bus stop, for example, or wait as long as the taxi goes on that street and take a taxi, or maybe put the old grocery in the bags, in their handle, something like that. And the point is that are we going to enter something like that? People are going to buy monthly or weekly for the whole family. How are we gonna answer this kind of issue for people? I see a lot of in my country that people buying a lot and put everything in their cars, and I don't know, maybe buying alone or maybe buy with their families and then go to their home. And the point is that are bicycles or public transportation going to answer this kind of needs for people?
Yes. What you're describing there is that people adopt to whatever it is they have as tools. When I live in the US, I go to the supermarket once a week because I have to go 5 or 6 miles and I take my car. In Zurich, I go shopping almost every day because the supermarket is 2 blocks away. So this, in order to live in a car non-dependency place, the land use has to support that kind of living also. And we need to think of all of these things as working together. The ways that we live in car culture is different from the ways that we live without car culture. And the question I would like to ask you though is, not everybody in your cities own cars. What do poor people do? Again, it's this issue in a lot of these cities. We are talking about a very elite that can afford cars. Lots of people can't afford cars in some of these countries.
Oh, in my country, that's a great question. I live in Isfahan, and we have around 2 million people in Isfahan. Yes, 2 million inhabited, I guess. And because of the support of the government, people buy cars. And we have two kind of prices for owning car. The prices that comes from the factory and the prices that you can buy from, let's say it, in private car sellers, something like that. There's a big difference. So people are going to buy cars from the factory and by going to enroll in a something like what do you call it? It's something like I forgot the word. Something. Let me give you an example of that. When you're going to when you are going to ask for a green card, you go to enroll in something. Then they decide to give you a green card. Okay, so it's not about that you're 100% sure that you're going to get a green card. So getting a car, owning a car in Iran is like that. You go to site in their factory websites, and they decide that okay, they're going to give you a car. Just a moment. I forgot the word. Maybe I have to search about the word. Sorry.
That's all right. I get to the sense of what you're talking about. It sounds like
I think
it's very, very supportive situation. But the point I was making is that some of the changes that we're talking about here it's not just about changing what kind of vehicle people use, but it also changing how we live, where we live. This is why I was saying that when I lived in Jamaica, I didn't have a car. I shopped differently. I shopped from the small guy at the corner. I didn't go to the big supermarket. Those are the kind of changes that are tied to this. But it's not a change that is necessarily going to occur overnight in a lot of places because of how they are. But there are so many places where we could immediately make changes. And maybe your city is not one of them, but there are plenty places, even in your home country, where people could make changes that would make it easier for people that don't have cars.
Yes, that's what I see that people are asking for bike lanes, but on the other hand, authorities are destroying those bike lanes because bike lanes, they believe that bike lanes bring much traffic for us. So they're giving the places for cars. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome. Yes.
Yes.
So we have Maria Valeria. You have a question?
It's not a question. I wanted to just add what a professor say about what do countries or cities do poor people that they cannot afford a car. What is going on in many cities, especially in medium-sized cities in Argentina, is that people that cannot afford a car, they buy a motorbike. And that's a big problem because it's the main cause for accidents nowadays. And something also similar is happening in Buenos Aires. So yes, that is a big issue that we have with motorbikes nowadays because some of them, they say that they prefer to go by motorbike instead of public transport because even it's cheaper. Yeah, that's only wanted to add that.
Professor Garrick, did you have some thoughts to share on that too, the motorbikes she's referring to?
Well, I mean, a motorbike is, it's in many cases, it takes less space, but it has a lot of the same problems as cars. And again, it goes back to how we are building places. If you can't walk, or if transit is not funded and it's overcrowded, then people go for different options. So, you know, all of these things are, it's about choices. It's about what kind of choices we are giving people that are real. And in a lot of places, we're not giving them real choices.
A lot of the work at Pedestrian Space is about that too. It's about mobility choices. So I think there's some more questions here, but I think later on towards the end of the call, I would love to hear more about a little bit deeper into the snapshot of your daily living in Zurich, because it is all about choice. And I love how you say that, you know, the option to live without a car is freedom, and without experiencing that, as we know, as many people on this chat know, Professor Garrick, as you know, having been car dependent in other places, that option to experience that freedom of a walkable lifestyle doesn't exist for many people. But maybe we could circle back to that. Matvey in the Ukraine. Oh, you want to?
Just let me quickly say this, is that, you know, we can look at all the obstacles there are to changing, but the truth is that there are many low-hanging fruit that we can go after. It's not either having cars or not having cars. It's really the fact that we have built places where you have to have cars for everything. So if we start with that we don't need to have cars for everything in any place, that there are some trips that you don't need cars for. If you start there, then you can start to make change. And also, if you also realize that you're building places where people don't feel safe to walk, that means that they have to get into cars. That's another way of dealing with this without thinking about it as this massive change that is needed.
Right. Matvey, did you have a question?
Yeah. You hear me well?
Yes.
Yep. So my question is mostly about building a city pedestrianized and bikeable, because my city Kharkiv is gets 25% of building bombed, and that is why I'm asking questions about how to start a building in the city that is pedestrianized and bikeable. So what do you think, Norman Garrick, the first steps to build the city pedestrianized and bikeable and without a car-dependent infrastructure?
Yeah, it's kind of makes me sad to think about, well, firstly, what's happening in your country, but secondly, my experience of people rebuilding cities has not been very promising one. And one of the experience I've had is in Mississippi, when a large tracts of the coastline was destroyed by the Hurricane Katrina 20 years ago. And there was lots of talk about rebuilding city. I think, yes, it's an opportunity to consider how we want to rebuild, but it's really, it's a tough road, because people are going to come with ideas about how to do things quickly, and it's probably going to draw on the whole car, the kind of patterns of suburbia that has failed in the US, unfortunately. But hopefully, with enough strong voices, we can have a different approach.
Yeah, it can actually fall in that I would call it American hall or something. But our mayor is pretty good about it, and he already engaged some world architects. For example, Norman Foster is gonna help to rebuild the Kharkiv, and also some German filials and Madrid ones. Yeah. That is
Well,
information for now.
as I said, I think it's really, I mean, it's a tragedy, but there are possibilities that come from that, and I so wish you well in the rebuilding process. It does present an opportunity to think about things differently. And I really don't know what your city was like. I mean, one of the things that is important is not change, but is understanding how you can build on what you have and make it better. A lot of what gets done all around the world is that we start new and we start different, and we go in, we don't really build on what was there and make it better. And that's the tragedy that you see in a lot of places all over the world.
If I could
Thanks.
just,
That's some great words.
Matvi, it was really so lovely to see you walking in the forest there. Professor Garrick, everybody, as I mentioned on this call, is part of the Global Walkability Correspondence Network, and Matvi is our youngest correspondent in the Ukraine and aspiring to go into urban planning studies, so city planning. And I actually have a question connected to that, is that what could you potentially recommend to youth, teenagers, and then people going into their bachelor's studies who are interested in this mobility paradigm shift and bringing it into their core of their research as your professor?
Well, I think one of the things is that it is exciting that people are questioning the paradigms that we grew up with. I have been reading Peter Norton's book. I just started reading it recently. And what fascinates me about it is that it has taken us years to kind of unravel the underlying premises of what the car proponents were trying to do. They were, for example, they were trying to get more and more people to buy cars. And for years, people in academia talks about things like induced traffic. But then you would have a body of people, the mainstream of academia would say that doesn't exist. But when you read Peter Norton's book, what he says is that that's exactly what these people wanted. They knew exactly what they were doing. But yet it took us years to then convince people that what they wanted to do was exactly what they were doing, because they had their plans, they knew what they were doing, but then they denied it in public. And then we have lots of academic people who supported this denial and hiding. And sometimes reading Peter's book makes me feel like a fool, because what we're doing is unraveling the truth that we didn't realize that was really the operating principle that was hidden from us. It's kind of like what was done in the 1960s and 70s about smoking and trying to get at the truth of that. So maybe what I'm saying is make sure you get into the right places if you're going to study urban planning, because there is still a lot of inertia in academia that still is wedded to the status quo. So make sure that you select the right place to study.
I see that Professor Daniela Bonato has made a comment. Daniela, would you like to share your comment or question? Potentially, if you want to ask it in Portuguese, we can ask Andrea.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, I can try. Hello. I was thinking about what Professor Garrick said about living car-dependent cities, totally different in a city that's it's dependent on car. I experienced it. I lived 13 years in Rio de Janeiro. It's a big city, and I lived 5 months, just 5 months in Portugal last year. And when I lived there, I walked a lot and used to walk to go to the public transportation. And I went healthier than I was before. And when I lived in Rio de Janeiro, it was a little bit different, a lot of different, because it's a city that depends on cars a lot. Even there, we have public transportation, mass public transportation like metro. But in the same city, it's like Professor Gary said about the way you can live. If the place when you can live, if this neighborhood is no car dependent, you can reach all things by foot or on bicycle. It's different if you need to live far on their cities. And now I live in a small city, Vitória, size is like 400 inhabitants, and now I can ride a bike to my work, and it's totally different. But here in Brazil, in the last years, people that can't own a car are buying motorcycles, like in Argentina, buying a lot, and this number of motorcycles has increased a lot in the last years, and it was worse in the pandemic time, because people choose to not use the public transportation. So we have here the cost of transportation, the families, the medium is 18% of their income lost if you receives not too much. They lost 18% of their rent of their income in transportation. So it's very difficult for people who has not the possibility, who have car, to have a car, and is also difficult to people who has a car. It's horrible, and it's getting worse. We lost the opportunity to increase our bicycle infrastructure as many cities made, and now we are. Some cities is trying to change this culture, but we cannot see a very big difference, a very big changing, except in a few cities that has a pedestrian planning for transportation and the increasing of bicycle lanes.
Yeah, I mean, in a country like Brazil, I think what's important there is the direction from the federal government, and I don't think you're getting that right now from the federal government that you have.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the important things that you're talking about in a city like Rio is the quality of the public transportation. And that depends to some extent on directions of the federal government and leadership from there.
Indeed. Thank you.
But as I said, and I mean, Curitiba used to be a model. I don't know where they are now, but that shows even in that environment how change can happen. And Curitiba was built around the bus rapid transits.
Yes, and they use the development or transit development oriented, and now São Paulo in the last urban planning, they used it to improve the TOD, and they have interesting situations to improve the mass transportation and increase the density in that lines of public transportation. But Curitiba is it still is our best example.
Yes.
Unfortunately, because they begin 40 years last 40 years ago, and now we are not still.
You're trying to catch up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's good to have models like Curitiba because they serve as what can be done. So it's really exciting when you have a model like that to draw on.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
I want to comment that Beverly had to leave, but she said that was fantastic, Professor Garrick. I learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mohammed, I see you have a comment and a question. Would you like to ask your question?
Is that question? Yes, I'd like to ask my question. Just Professor. Sorry for that. My brother was annoying me. My question is about, people have a belief that they need car for almost everything. How are we gonna change that belief? And do we have to just say that, okay, you need to try cycling and see how it's amazing or something like that? Because I tried something like that and try to, by walking and advocating, I try to convince others, especially my friends, to just use public transportation, walking, something like that. But at the end, I faced with this kind of, this interesting phrase. They said that you walk too much and you need to own a car because you might reach your point B sooner if you had a car. How are we going to change that habit?
So, Mohammed, where are you calling from?
I'm from Iran, SR.
Okay.
Iran,
all right. I was just curious about where you are. My attitude about this has been that it's not about the individual. It's not only about the individual. That getting people to change, telling people, for example, they should ride their bike when it's dangerous to ride their bike, I don't think is necessarily a good policy, because it's about the infrastructure that we create. And so we have to somehow be able to get to the policymakers to change the situation so that people can see that it is safe to walk, it is safe to get around. Individual behavior is important, yes. And for me, I always try to use transit. But I really don't try to say to somebody else that you should use transit if it doesn't work. I remember going to Detroit and using transit there was a nightmare. And I used it because I want to experience it. But for most people, it doesn't make sense. What we as advocates have to be able to advocate for is change at policy, at some higher level where things start to make sense, that people actually feel that they have real choices. So yeah, I think it's really tough to change people's mind in a situation where the choices are not good for them. So maybe what you can do is, for example, show them situations or put them in situations like if it's possible to take them to a city where people live differently, then maybe they might start to see the light then.
Thanks a lot. That was great. Yes, I see. It's a big, it's a big conflict to have others to support, to feel what you are feeling. Yes. I say it takes more time.
And I think a lot of times, if you can get people into different situations, then that's what makes the difference. Like the professor from Brazil, I don't remember her name, was saying, living in Portugal, that the contrast between Porto and Rio de Janeiro, anybody can that experience that can relate to it.
Yes, I see. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. We're coming up on the end of the roundtable here, but we have time for some more questions. So Andrea.
Hi, Professor. I would like to know what you think about mobility in small cities where the mass transport doesn't work. There's not enough people in order to make them viable. So how can we work mobility on small cities and public mobility?
Small cities are really interesting because some of the worst, certainly in America and even here in Switzerland, some of the worst excessive of auto dependency you see in small cities where people could actually walk or bike. Biking in particular would work in a lot of small places. But the worst excesses, big roads, big highways, you see in small cities. So I think the focus on walkability, bikeability in smaller places makes a lot of sense. But I should also say, though, that in small cities, transit can work. It doesn't really take a great population for transit to work. In many Swiss cities, there are mostly car oriented, but they have very solid public transit. And the reason you need public transit is because you have old people, you have blind people, you have school kids, all of those people need transit. And you have people that just don't want to drive. So it can work in small cities, not in the same metros and trams, etc., buses, different kinds of transit, but they can work in small cities. But there are a lot of opportunities in small cities to fix things like oversized roads, etc.
I hear that we do have a big car dependency. In Brazil in general, we do have a big car dependency in small cities. Usually in small, the public the transport ends up not being viable economically. So
Well,
we,
I mean, public transport, I have a problem with that term being viable economically, because public transportation, very few places in the world is public transportation a profit-making enterprise. So it's really about who is going to pay for what. I mean, the governments are always willing to pay for big roads, for lots of things relating to cars. They're not paying for transit to the extent that is needed. And you know, when you pay and provide transit at the level that you need to, it then becomes less expensive because more people use it. So there's that vicious cycle, but to make that case is really tough.
Okay, thank you.
Desiree Azul. You have a question, Desiree?
Desiree.
Yes. Hello. Oh,
Hello,
I'm sorry.
Desiree.
I was just writing what you just said because it was interesting. Hello. Can you see me? Oh, yeah.
Yes. And where are you calling
Well,
from?
this is, I'm calling from Querétaro, Mexico.
From where?
Querétaro, Mexico.
Oh, okay. What state is that?
What state? It's called Querétaro. It's like 3 hours away from Mexico City.
Mexico City. Okay.
Yeah, not far away from there.
Yes.
So my question is about what are your insights about the lack of sense of ownership that we have of our streets? Because I think what you just said, like we can ask for politicians or municipalities to improve our streets, but I think that we cannot ask anything if we don't think it's ours. If I don't think it's mine to improve, mine to share, mine to live there. Like before realizing all this problematic, for me, it was like, okay, there's a new street. The government built a new street. That's it.
Yes.
But now I think, like, who decided that street is going to be like that? Who decided the sidewalk was going to be this wide? Who? And why? And I want answers, but that's because now I see the streets as mine. So what are your thoughts about this lack of sense? Is it right? Lack of sense of ownership.
I think you're hit on a really important point. Who owns the streets? Who owns the city? I mean, whose city is it? And that is a change that we're seeing all over, certainly in the US, but I think we've seen it in Mexico also, in Mexico City, is the sense that one of the things that people have recognized is that streets are the biggest public space in cities. And so we need to have control over that. The streets decide how cities look, how they feel, how they behave. And so people need to take ownership of that. And I think that's a really, really, really important point, is to drive home that sense of ownership. It's not the government's. And even worse, it's not for people that are owning cars. It's for the citizens. In the past, we would look at streets as being about the cars in engineering and ignore the fact that people live on the street, people eat on the street, all of those other functions. So bringing in the function and the sense of ownership, I think, is so important to any change that can occur. Yeah, so I totally agree with what you're saying.
Thank you. Well, I don't have anything more to share. Thank you so much.
No, I think it's a really, really, really important thing, is that this sense of ownership and giving over the use of public space to who you give it over to and who should control that space. And that has changed in America, and that has been a really important change because we need people's input in terms of how these streets should develop.
Yeah, because the main street, well, the street that I take every single day is not it's an important street for the area. There's the residential area, then after that there's the commercial area, so you can buy your groceries, there's a school over there as well, pharmacies, there's many local local stores, but it is really annoying for me to have to get groceries there because it's like cars everywhere. They cannot park. There's people helping them to get out of the store with their cars. And I go by bike and I see that like there's space enough to build a bike lane and space enough to get parking and space enough for everyone basically, but it's not built that way. I see a lot of potential, but it's not built that way, and we are as here we are we are normalizing the abnormal. Like, how can we accept living this way?
Yep.
It's just
and the worst part of it in a lot of places that we have normalized living with lots of people dying from crashes. That's the very worst sense of it. In America, we have 40,000 people dead every year, and we just live with it.
Yeah, so yeah, start questioning. It's like to start denormalizing the abnormal, maybe.
Yes, definitely. What is normal is for people to be able to enjoy their homes and their cities and their places. And it's not just about moving things as fast as possible through.
But enjoying your life as well, I think.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, we are coming up on 7:30 p.m. Does anybody else have any questions? Mohammed, I thought I saw your hand raised. One thing I learned for future roundtables, Professor Garrick, I'm curious to share. Well, I'm interested in sharing with you. I should have asked people to share what cities they were in, but on this particular roundtable, we've had participants talking to you from the US, Brazil, Mexico, Iran, Ukraine, Germany, Canada, and India. So I'm thankful to everybody for being here. This has been a really exciting, I can't think of a better kickoff to a roundtable series, and I'm really hoping to have you again for a featured roundtable, maybe a panel talk with some of your fellow professionals who work with these issues. So I'm curious if anybody else has any further questions. If not, we'll be closing out. I see Professor Bonato, you have a question. What do you think about
the shared spaces? I started writing about shared spaces about 20 years ago when they were just coming into vogue. I think they're really important. It's really what it is a different way of thinking about streets. It's thinking about streets as a place for lots of people, lots of things, not just for movement. And lots of cities, lots of streets in cities should be shared spaces because that's what a city is about. And so, for example, in Zurich here, a lot of streets are being converted to what you call naked streets, but shared spaces work for me also. I remember using naked streets when I started writing about this years ago. And I can tell you when I did a search for my article, you can imagine what would come up. So I stopped using that term. But yes, the shared streets it's a really important concept. It's a really important structural way of changing how we see streets. The street I'm looking at in front of me right here, I would say, is a shared space. It's very simple. It has a sidewalk, it has cars parked, but the cars are parked in blocks so that you have to go around them in kind of like a snake-like way, and it's a two-directional street. So it's a very slow street. It feels like a street that is comfortable to live on. And that's the kind of changes that are needed for a lot of our streets. My next door neighbor kids are always drawing chalk objects on the streets and playing hopscotch on the streets also.
That's wonderful. So I think when we publish this video, it would be really interesting to also share some of your photos in a post. So a photo series by Professor Norman Garrick with a window onto your world in Zurich. So I want to say thank you very much for being here. I know the group thanks you. I'm thankful to all the participants, and Professor Garrick, I look forward to hosting you for more talks in the future.
It was a great pleasure. It was fascinating learning about all the different places that you're all from. And I've seen a lot of places around the world, but what is interesting to me is how much of the experiences in different places are shared and in trying to deal with autodependency and trying to build places for the people that live there. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you as well. This is a good time to break. My daughter's joining me, and I know you have a dinner engagement. So guten Appetit. Thank you.
Danke,
and we'll see you again.
And ade, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you
Bye.
very
Bye, thank
much.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.